Hello, this is Will Imboden from the Clement Center here at the University of Texas at Austin. Welcome to our latest episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Today we're going to be hearing from Professor John Ciorciari of the Ford School at the University of Michigan, who is also the director of their fantastic new Weiser Center for Diplomacy. Professor Ciorciari is going to be speaking on sovereignty sharing in fragile states.
Thank you. Very, very nice to see you all, and thanks so much for having me out. I'm so impressed with all that the Clement Center has done under Will's leadership, and delighted to be able to talk to you today. This is from a book project about sovereignty sharing in fragile states, and the cover image is an iconic example of that. This is a picture of a bunch of U.S. Marines landing beside the presidential palace in Port-au-Prince, Haiti in 2010 after the earthquake ravaged that island nation. And there was a quote attributed to then President Rene Preval in Hillary Clinton's book Hard Choices, in which Preval called her up and said, we're in shambles and we need your help. Right now, we need you to be Haiti because we can't do it. And that's the essence of this sort of phenomenon of sovereignty sharing. Cases in which national governments are unwilling or unable to carry out what we consider to be core sovereign functions. In this case, policing the streets of the capital city, and so contracting essentially with international actors to not only perform the functions, but importantly to hold the authority, informally or formally, to carry out core sovereign functions. So I want to talk a little bit about what is sovereignty sharing, what do I mean by that, why it matters, what are the conditions under which it could work. I'm going to give a couple of really brief, sort of 5-minute sketches each, or 10 minutes each, on Cambodia, Liberia, and Guatemala, so you have a sense of what some of these engagements have looked like in practice, and a few takeaways. This image at the UN from the UN Trusteeship Council is an image of the sort of the angel helping the bird to take off and fly. And the normative argument for sovereignty sharing is the notion that societies under stress could benefit from some sort of external engagement that would help prepare them for a brighter future by putting some air underneath their wings and helping them take off. So what does sovereignty sharing mean? Well, it doesn't mean anything with respect to a state's juridical status as sovereign. You can only have one sovereign state juridically, and the state retains that status as the ultimate sovereign. But sovereignty isn't just about a juridical status. Sovereignty is also about the entitlement to govern domestically that flows from that juridical status. And that component of sovereignty, or that face of sovereignty, can be unbundled, disaggregated, and shared. And in fact, is shared all the time. We live in a federal system. Sovereign authority to be able to govern is split between states, localities, the federal government. It's also possible to share sovereignty with international actors. It could be through pooling mechanisms like the European Union, or it could be through the kinds of contracts that I'm talking about today with fragile states. The big question is whether a third face of sovereignty, which is the notion of sovereignty as a right to non-interference, Westphalian sovereignty, whether that's compromised by this unbundling of certain authorities and sharing of them with international actors. I'm not going to answer that now, but it's a thread that we'll come back to throughout the presentation. If we think about fragile state governance engagements, sovereignty sharing exists in a kind of middle space between ordinary technical assistance that comes packaged with loans and grants from World Bank or USAID or other international agencies. That's ubiquitous. And on the other end, neo-trusteeship, like in the case of Kosovo or East Timor in 1999, or for a brief period, the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq arguably fits this model. This is very rare because it's extremely expensive. It's normatively highly contentious. I don't expect to see this come back into vogue anytime soon. It's very closely associated with colonial histories. So for a variety of reasons, neo-trusteeship is decidedly out of favor at the moment and is likely to remain that way. This is everywhere, but it's often not enough to deal with really deep and wide governance gaps in fragile states. So if you have a case like the Haiti earthquake, and there are people looting all of the businesses downtown in Port-au-Prince, and the police have gone home because they're looking for their family members and not watching what's happening on the streets, then sending out a couple technical assistance advisors isn't going to do you very much. And so sovereignty sharing is a middle ground. And it's arguably rising. At least these cases have become more numerous over time. It includes things like complex peacekeeping operations where you might have UN police or African Union police patrolling alongside local officials. It could be hybrid criminal courts or tribunals in which international and national judges sit side by side and issue judgments about accountability. It could be anti-corruption commissions, for example, in which you have, again, a mix of personnel exercising authority that would usually be solely the state's preserve. And so Steve Krasner, who's at Stanford, whom I've co-authored with on this, and who sort of coined this term in the academic literature in the mid-2000s, saw this as at least worth exploring as a policy option, because these other options on the menu aren't often very appealing. This one's too onerous, too intrusive, and so forth, and this one is often insufficient. And so maybe we should think about, he argued 15 years ago, sharing sovereignty in some limited cases. And now we've had enough observable cases that we can start to draw some conclusions about what works and what doesn't in shared sovereignty. To give you a sense of the universe of cases, I'm only going to briefly sketch three, but you have hybrid courts in places like Timor-Leste, Cambodia, Lebanon, Kosovo, Bosnia, Central African Republic, Senegal, and Sierra Leone. You have policing missions that involve a sharing of core authorities around arrest and detention in Haiti, in, again, Central African Republic, in Solomon Islands, in Timor-Leste, in Kosovo, and a few other places. You've got anti-corruption mechanisms of various forms that also mix domestic and international personnel in carrying out domestic authority. In Afghanistan, in Angola and Mozambique with the customs, also in Guatemala, and now also in Honduras. And so it's a manageable universe to look at in a book, but it's enough observations that we can start to draw at least some preliminary conclusions about what's going on. And the important question to ask is, of course, why does this matter? Why are these ventures so important? This is just a picture of the migrant caravan coming up from Honduras. And the question, I'm sure, is discussed every day on this campus. What's the range of policy interventions available to deal with this human and political crisis? Some of the policy options exist on the border between Brownsville and Matamoros, and some of them exist in Honduras or in El Salvador or in Guatemala. And in cases where you have severe governance failings because of corruption, state-linked criminality, and so forth, the question arises, is sovereignty sharing a viable path to consider? Is it a means of trying to address some of the governance gaps that are giving rise to the suffering reflected in the caravan and many other examples around the world? Sovereignty sharing has two basic objectives, and they're important to distinguish for reasons I'll explain in a moment. One is to fill basic gaps in service provision. There's looting going on in the streets. Somebody needs to police that neighborhood. And so you send out a group of people like these Nepalese UN peacekeepers, and they police the neighborhood to try to provide a kind of stopgap measure during the crisis. And then the second aim is to somehow use that experience of working closely together to transmit best practices and norms to domestic counterparts, so that the newly reconstituted Timorese police force will themselves over time be capable of carrying out policing effectively and also responsibly with regard to basic human rights. Ideally, if that process works well, you should see a sort of a virtuous cycle in which the two sides bring together complementary knowledge and skills. Often the outsiders have more money, have fancier equipment, have more technical knowledge in a given domain, and local actors have, of course, linguistic and contextual and other forms of knowledge, cultural understanding of cultural norms. If they're able to work well together, then they perform effectively in terms of delivering justice or security. The public sees both the intervening party and the local actor as more legitimate. That legitimacy elicits cooperation from the public, which makes it easier to maintain the peace or to monitor corruption, and the virtuous cycle takes hold. Eventually, the international actors can peel off and go home, and at least in the best possible case, someone like the Timorese Prime Minister Jose Ramos Horta can say to Ban Ki-moon, thank you and your team, your job's done here now, domestic institutions are in a better place. That's the hope, that's the aspiration. But we have to ask the question about when does this occur? When is it appropriate normatively, and when is it likely to achieve those objectives? One of the other examples that's been a very difficult one is the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, set up to deal with the assassination of then former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri on Valentine's Day 2005 in Beirut. And you've got this tribunal in the Netherlands that is reconstructing the scene of the crime, but is holding a trial in absentia because they're unable to apprehend the suspects from Hezbollah. And back home in Lebanon, people are still protesting, saying, what about all of the disappeared during the country's long and grueling civil war? We want to ask, is this type of mechanism not only appropriate, but when is it going to be able to actually make a dent in the rule of law challenges that exist there? There's a lot of normative debate around this concept, as you can imagine. On the plus side, you can say there's real human security needs in the societies we're talking about, and therefore trying to devise a remedy that would provide at least a stopgap protection would be normatively kosher and desirable. There are spillover security problems, migration, refugee flows, interstate conflict, providing grounds for terror organizations, you name it, that come from these governance gaps. There's a strong argument to be made that when asked their preferences, that most people around the world say Weberian rule of law institutions sound pretty good. The rulers aren't allowed to just flaunt the law and actually are subject to laws. It's a rule of law, not a rule by law. And when polled by academics and others, populations around the world say that this is the kind of government they want. So then one would say, okay, well then normatively, if the goal of the intervention is to implant that may be defensible. And the logic of responsibility to protect. If a sovereign is not meeting its obligations to its people, then external actors have not just a right, but in some cases a duty to intervene to try to help remedy the situation. All arguments in favor of considering sovereignty sharing when the conditions are right. But on the flip side, you can also imagine lots of potent normative arguments against it. The idea that this would be an infringement of Westphalian rights because a country isn't likely to give up its levers of domestic control unless it's highly dependent on outsiders, and so that vitiates the consent. Self-determination and best fit institutions. Well, shouldn't countries be able to determine the kinds of institutions that they think best fit in light of their stage of development and their culture? This is a very common, in fact, this is a majority argument in the General Assembly, and it's represented on the Security Council most consistently by the Chinese and Russian representatives. Even the World Bank, though, acknowledges that sometimes Weberian institutions aren't realistic, and that what needs to be the goal are so-called best fit institutions in light of the country's economic development stage and other factors. And so there's a lot of pushback to the idea of sovereignty sharing that just like with the Washington Consensus, that the types of institutions and the types of practices and norms that external actors arrive to implant aren't necessarily the most suitable or realistic for the local environment. And then, of course, all of this is happening against the backdrop of anti-colonial norms and concerns about the will of the powerful being exerted vis-a-vis weaker polities. And so the point of putting up these normative pros and cons is not that I'm going to try to adjudicate the normative case here. That's not what the book project is about. What I wanted to do, though, is to set this up to say this is inevitably going to be controversial, and therefore it's going to entail significant political costs to design and to implement this kind of venture. It's also going to be the case that if these ventures don't work well, there are a lot of normative arguments that are going to be leveled against them. And therefore, one has to think, whether one's an academic or a policymaker, what are the conditions under which sovereignty sharing could deliver effective services and be regarded as legitimate. It's not an easy task. And it's not an easy task both because of the practical difficulty of filling governance gaps in fragile states. It's also a difficult task because of the normative contestation. I argue, based on looking at all those cases I represent with triangles on the world map, that sovereignty sharing sometimes does provide a very useful bandage in the form of stopgap service provision. And there are quite a number of examples, including all three that I'll share today, in which joint ventures provided markedly better services than reasonably could have been expected of domestic institutions left on their own. And yet, in few, if any, cases have we seen a strong, lasting imprint on domestic institutions in terms of governance reform. And a great example is the case of Sierra Leone. The Special Court of Sierra Leone, a hybrid court set up to deal with atrocities during the country's civil war in the late 1990s, has delivered credible verdicts, has relied on copious evidence and on, if not always objectively correct, at least plausible legal reasoning to reach its verdicts, has managed to convict some of the worst wartime offenders, and is generally regarded as one of the most successful hybrid ventures in service provision. But go to Freetown today, and the youth prison downtown looks like this. And it's embedded within this set of links on a chain of a very, very weak domestic judicial system. And so while the sovereignty sharing venture was able to provide some credible justice for some of the worst offenses in the country's modern history, its reach has been very, very limited when it comes to the judicial system that Sierra Leoneans see every day, and that will continue going forward. So when does it work, or what are the conditions under which it can be effective? It, of course, hinges a lot on when preferences align between domestic elites and international elites who are the joint architects of these ventures. And there are a couple conditions when that happens. There can be crises, like in the Solomon Islands in 2003 and then again in 2006, when ethnic strife broke out and that threatened to decimate the state. The police basically collapsed into rival warring factions, and the Prime Minister called up the Australian government and other international actors to say, we desperately need your help, our state is on the brink of collapse. Obviously, there's a convergence of interests and preferences in that window of time. Sometimes it's not a crisis as much as just a political transition in which new incumbents are in office but still rely heavily on external support to be able to build their positions in power. Good examples here are the gradual handoff of the UN to independent Timor-Leste and Kosovo. Shared threats. Sometimes the national and international actors can't agree on justice writ large, but they can both agree that there are certain rebel leaders that we want to try and convict for their atrocities during the war. This was the sort of glue that initiated the special court process for Sierra Leone. And sometimes, we'll talk about the Guatemala case later, popular pressure can actually contribute significantly to this sort of attractive force because a population wants international actors involved to make the process run, they expect, more effectively, more legitimately than domestic process alone. But those bonds are usually fragile. For one thing, consent from the sovereign is usually compromised. It's compromised because they're in a crisis and they have little other choice, or it's compromised in the sense that it is qualified. I'm interested in trying these particular war criminals, but not those, because these are my political adversaries and these are my friends. As a result of this sort of reluctance to share sovereign authority over an extended period or over an extended domain of policy, the agreements are usually ambiguous. Ambiguous agreements that leave unclear the boundaries of a judicial process or the authority of an anti-corruption commission or the precise division of roles and responsibilities between national and international police. Those are all examples of how agreements are left deliberately vague so that national authorities and international authorities can cut a deal. If it were much more explicit, very often the deal wouldn't happen because it would be, if it were clear, for example, that the internationals have this policing authority and the nationals have that policing authority, it would often be very difficult for both sides to do it and to save face politically. And so you have ambiguous agreements. That therefore, what that means is that there are fewer binding legalistic ties between the parties. The viability of the joint venture is going to depend more on the continued existence of a political equilibrium, not on tightly controlled, legally defined roles and responsibilities. And so over time, when these are implemented, it's difficult because the equilibrium is unstable. Leaders change power. They, as I said, are reluctant to share and often will try to reclaim authority. Sometimes there's a mismatch in supply and demand. The international actors show up and say we're going to be able to deliver better services, but that doesn't always happen. Policing is particularly difficult. Imagine being a beat cop in Austin and then getting sent to Central African Republic and told to manage security in the capital of Bangui. That's not an easy task, linguistically, geographically, in terms of the common expectations of police practices. And so sometimes this doesn't go well, and as a result, the political support for the venture weakens during implementation. And above all, domestic elites can capture the process. All of these problems have bedeviled the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, which was advocated by then Prime Minister Fouad Siniora, an ally of Hariri politically, who wanted to see an inquiry into Hariri's assassination, and challenged by Hassan Nasrallah, head of Hezbollah, and other actors in Lebanon. The Lebanese government was unable ultimately to consent through a treaty because Nasrallah and allies in parliament refused to ratify it. So the UN had to eventually attach the agreement that Siniora had signed as an annex to a Chapter 7 Security Council resolution, so that it essentially became binding on the Lebanese state. But in implementation, there were a lot of ways in which the Lebanese authorities could drag their feet, and one of them was not to try in any meaningful way to apprehend the suspects. And so, for a variety of reasons, this case epitomizes some of the challenges of shared sovereignty. I told you I would walk through 3 cases really briefly. I'm going to try to do it in about 5 minutes each so that I don't take up too much time and you can ask questions. A hybrid tribunal in Cambodia, a co-signing scheme to deal with corruption and economic mismanagement in Liberia, and a commission in Guatemala set up to counter impunity but increasingly focused on corruption. So in Cambodia, you have a picture of this hybrid court called the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia. It was created in 2003, 2004 to deal with crimes of the Pol Pot regime in the late 1970s. For years, the UN and Cambodian government had locked horns over how to deal with that issue and how to promote accountability. Hun Sen, still the prime minister at left, arguing with Hans Korel, UN legal counsel here at right, broker in the middle, then Senator John Kerry. And Kerry is the one who hatched the idea of a hybrid court as a way of steering between the Cambodian government's preference for a wholly domestic process and the international actors, primarily the UN's interest in an internationally dominated process like the one for former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. The important point here is that the Cambodian consent was highly qualified to this venture. We will consent if we have primary control in terms of having greater number of judges on the court, and if it has quite narrow jurisdiction. The parties never agreed to exactly who would be tried. They just said it would be those who were deemed most responsible for the crimes of the Pol Pot era. And so that was meant to honor the principle of prosecutorial independence. But from the very start, there was no clear political agreement about whether this would be a few people, whether it would be a few dozen people, or even more who would stand trial. Lots of awkward institutional compromises. I mentioned ambiguous agreements as a common feature of shared sovereignty. And here, part of the ambiguity of this hybrid court was that it was not the subject of a treaty. It was the subject of a cooperative agreement between the Cambodian government and the UN. Is that an MOU? That's how the Cambodian government wanted to regard it, because that made it less binding and left them more control. Is it more like a treaty because both governments signed it, or an executive agreement? That's how the UN preferred to understand it. Procedural rules, unclear. It would follow Cambodian procedural rules unless there was a lacuna, in which case you'd look to international rules. But at that time, Cambodia's rules of criminal procedure were being revised. And the revision was from a badly outdated set of rules, basically from the French colonial period. And so the very legal identity of the court was unclear, and so were the rules that would be followed, in some cases the substantive laws that would be applied. That, again, what I said about ambiguous agreements is when there aren't clear understandings of roles and responsibilities, you're going to have to rely on a continual updating of the sort of political equilibrium to keep the thing on track, because the marching orders are not clear from the outset. There were some important positive outcomes. The Cambodian government had a handful of people whom it was willing to see stand trial and see convicted for the crimes of the Pol Pot period. 2 of them, Nuon Chea, who just passed away, Pol Pot's number 2, and Khieu Samphan, who was the sort of nominal head of state in the Pol Pot regime were convicted of genocide, of war crimes, of crimes against humanity. Duch, who was the infamous head of this S-21 prison some of you may have heard about, the Central Interrogation and Torture Facility, was also convicted. These trials weren't perfect, but they were certainly efforts to present abundant evidence, to cross-examine witnesses, to allow the defense to have a voice and zealous representation, to rely on multiple different forms of evidence, testimonial, documentary, forensic, and so forth. By national standards, these trials were very well done. They delivered verdicts that in many ways were far and above what one would have expected from the beleaguered national judicial system. And so there were some important positive outcomes. There were also some mutual learning. These are the co-prosecutors at the time, Andrew Cayley, a Brit, and Chia Liang, a Cambodian. And this court had pairings of magistrates or investigating judges, of prosecutors, of administrators, of defense lawyers. At every part of the court, there were opportunities day to day to work together and learn. This is a process I've followed for many years. I've been involved in Cambodia for the last 2 decades. And so I know a lot of these people personally and a lot of the staff on the court. They've learned a tremendous amount from each other by working together for years on end. Many of them have been able to take back to their home jurisdictions, whether it's Cambodia or elsewhere, a lot of what they learned. In particular, with regard to domestic institutions, many of the basic things practiced at this court were not a part of Cambodian practice before the court opened its doors. For example, judges rarely issued reasoning for their judgments. There was no organized court docket. There was no organized mechanism for maintaining chain of custody for evidence. I could go on, things that you take almost entirely for granted in a Texas court. Were not part of Cambodia's judicial system, and the folks who worked on this court were able to take some of that back, at least at a technical level. But what about cases where the government and the UN appointees disagreed? I mentioned that bit about personal jurisdiction. It was not clear how many would stand trial. The Cambodian government, in retrospect, clearly only wanted to have a couple of people put on trial who were their political adversaries, who weren't close to or connected with the current incumbent government, and who would be seen as the heads of the regime, sort of decapitate what's left of the Khmer Rouge, and say that justice has been done. The international appointees often, there have been a number of them, many of them have quit because of frustration and so forth, but successive international prosecutors and investigating judges have put forward additional suspects. And Government Information Minister Q Kenneret at one point said, "You United Nations folks, if you don't drop it, you can pack your bags and go home." I guess I'm holding up the wrong hand. You can pack your bags and go home. The Prime Minister Hun Sen said more or less the same thing. If you ever want to see what judicial interference looks like, this is it, okay? It was very, very clear political interference in the judicial process, and the government has stonewalled these additional cases for years, almost a decade now. What are these additional cases? Well, I mentioned Nuon Chea was the number 2 of Pol Pot, Khieu Samphan, a senior official. There were a few other senior officials who passed away, who were also at the senior decision-making level. That's one case. Another case was Duch, the central security apparatus. A third case proposed by internationals would be senior surviving military officials to deal with crimes within their purview. And a fourth was to look at some of the most notorious zone or region level commanders. Think of this as sort of state level atrocities in Pol Pot's Cambodia. Sounds like a reasonable, at least a plausible strategy. People can disagree who's most responsible, who meets that standard, who doesn't. But the vast majority of external observers think that at least these are the cases 3 and 4 are debatable. Every Cambodian judge, every Cambodian prosecutor, every Cambodian administrator has said no. And it's very clear to everyone why. And so when this court reached the boundaries of what the government deemed politically possible, it was unable to proceed further. And so people like Im Chiem, who is a former district-level commander who's believed to have been responsible for deaths ranging from anywhere from 10,000 to 100,000 people in her zone, in her district in northwest Cambodia. She's one of those who is almost certainly not going to stand trial because the government has said that she doesn't qualify as most responsible. What's the real reason here? There are a few that appear to be the case. One is that in the process of dealing with the Khmer Rouge after the Pol Pot regime was deposed, the government made deals with a number of people and brought them back into the fold in order to get them to lay down their arms. So there are some skeletons in the closet in that respect that the government may not wish to shine a light on. Another problem is that the Hun Sen leadership itself, many of them were junior-level Khmer Rouge cadres when the Khmer Rouge took power, then defected to Vietnam and came back and threw Pol Pot out. They may fear that they would be eventually on the list of suspects, even though there doesn't appear to be any evidence against Hun Sen himself in the files. And a third reason, and this might be the most important of all, is that when the prime minister spoke and said that he was opposed to additional cases, his credibility was on the line, and he doesn't want to back down. And in a country like Cambodia, where the prime minister rules with a very stern hand, that principle appears to be politically very important to the governing regime. What it means is that this court no longer, to most people, looks like it's politically very independent at all, and it's lost some of its legitimacy despite some of the favorable outcomes that I described. Meanwhile, the domestic system continues to deteriorate. Judicial independence and credibility is an all-time low. Opposition figures like Kem Sokha have been brought up on specious charges of treason and so forth. There's very little. There's plenty of evidence, as I said, that technical learning has gone from the court into the Cambodian domestic system. There's no reason at all to think that big picture rule of law principles have been transferred from this hybrid process to the domestic system. On the contrary, Hun Sen seems to have decided in 2018 that he could no longer afford much more than just sort of a shadow of democracy in the country because he's lost the public support and he's chosen that he's therefore going to rule with force. And so some quick lessons from this. I mean, there's obvious risk of entering into an unhappy marriage. The UN knew that it was getting into an unhappy marriage with the Cambodian government because of mutual distrust. Those divergent preferences meant that you had a muddled institutional design. You could perform well within the agreed political frames, but as soon as you try to exit the area where there's an agreement or an interest alignment, very tough sledding for the UN, because ultimately the sovereign still retains a kind of normative upper hand. And partly for that reason, real challenges to reform. Very different mechanism far away in Liberia, but you'll see some common threads. This is the so-called Governance and Economic Management Assistance Program that ran from 2005 to 10 in Liberia. It was created to deal with a binge of theft of state assets that followed the end of the Civil War. After Taylor's diamond dictatorship and all of the killing, there was a transitional government set up in Liberia to bridge between when the Marines landed in Monrovia and when there would be national elections. Between 2003 to 5, this transitional government was busy with its members trying to line their pockets and the pockets of their friends and relatives before there would be an election. And there was very, very low revenues. In 2004, Liberia's revenues were only $45 million. Can you imagine? And one of the poorest states in the world, almost nothing in the way of institutional capacity. And so international donors, there had been a series of audits by the European Commission that had found this massive theft. It wasn't a surprise to anybody, but the scale even still managed to raise eyebrows. And so the donors, including the World Bank, the US government, the EU, and others, said to Judy Bryant, the transitional government leader, you're going to have to, if you want to get access to continued international financial assistance, and if you want to get access to continued assistance and security from the UN mission in Liberia that was present at the time, you need to agree to stationing international advisors in key government agencies and giving them co-signing authority to basically be watchdogs to monitor corruption. Bryant and others resisted fiercely on sovereignty grounds, but this guy, then U.S. Ambassador John Blaney, and others were able to convince him by essentially twisting his arm to agree to that arrangement. When the EU said that it was going to withhold $400 million of aid and the US made similar threats, Bryant eventually said uncle and signed the document. But this was a classic example of compromised consent. He didn't want to do it. By the way, the US had tried this before in the late 80s in Liberia during the Samuel Doe government. That hadn't worked well. If you're trying to share sovereignty, the sovereign has to, in some way, cooperate with the process. So it was off to a very, very shaky start. And it was an ambiguous arrangement, like the others I've mentioned. One way that the donors were able to get the Liberian transitional leader to sign was to leave very fuzzy what kind of authority that these international actors would have. They would have co-signing authority over key decisions, but without specifying in the agreement exactly which decisions would be subject to the deal. It was understood that some of them would be here in the rickety old Ministry of Finance. Some would be in the Forestry Development Association because Liberia's forests were being razed illegally. Some would be at the National Port Authority, where Monrovia's port was cluttered with capsized ships and rubble. There would also be some at the airport. There would be some at the central bank and so forth. A number of different key nodes. But the practice had to be worked out in each of these agencies by the people on the job, because the agreement didn't say which decisions are going to be subject to international vetoes. The turning point came in the election in early 2006, when Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was elected as the first female president in Africa. Sirleaf had opposed GMAP as a candidate, saying it was too much of an infringement on the country's sovereignty. But once she got to office, she said, she herself, a former World Bank official, said, I'm going to embrace this and support it and then try to make it unnecessary as soon as possible. In other words, it's a necessary evil. But that blessing, even though it was carefully framed to be temporary in nature, turned 180 degrees the direction of this venture. And because Sirleaf stood behind it, and because she appointed people like another former World Bank official, Antoinette Saye, as finance minister, and brought in some others, including a number of people who studied here in the States, to go back to Liberia and run different ministries, it was able actually to have some successes, enough so that in 2008, Hillary Clinton visited, and there were or 2009 rather, Hillary Clinton visited, and there were a number of other high-profile pieces done by USAID to champion this as a real success. What were some of the successes? Corruption at many of the state-owned enterprises and agencies where GMAP was located went way down. Revenues increased fourfold. Systems, again, very basic stuff. Just having an accounting ledger, just requiring that an agency that wants to spend money has it allocated in the national budget and there's funds for it in the central bank before you can get your purchase order. Just those types of things were missing in the transitional period. A lot of those basic systems were put in place. And as a result of those successes, Liberia was able to get the UN to end its sanctions on diamonds and timber from the country, to reopen its access to IMF credit and additional sources of World Bank and other international credit. It was a big success in that phase. Not perfect. In Q&A, if you want, I have 100 stories about the things that happened in these different SOEs and the personalities involved. But broad brush, the service provision component of GMAP went very well. The problem was that as GMAP wound down around 2009, 2010, and left, old habits reasserted themselves. Sirleaf herself, after a very successful first term, struggled in the second term. One reason she struggled was that she had appointed her sons in some important positions, and others in government came to her and said, you are now compromised yourself. Don't talk to us about nepotism and corruption, in a sense that weakened her hand in trying to enforce the terms of the deal. She sat at the top of GMAP in a sense and was less well positioned to be able to do that as she herself came under criticism for corruption. By the time she left office, Liberia had slid, just to use some rankings to give you some kind of a numerical sense. In 2004, in the Transparency International survey, Liberia was in the 150, 160 ranking. By the time GMAP finished, it had gone up to something like the 70s or 80s. By the time she left office, it had gone down to about 90-ish. Now it's back down to about 140. So there's been a big climb and then a big drop in the period when GMAP entered and after it left. You now have a kind of reversion to the circumstances that brought about GMAP's creation to begin with. George Weah, the former FIFA Football Player of the Year, soccer star from Liberia, is now president. It's ironic. One reason why the US government was so concerned about putting GMAP in place in 2004 and 5 was they feared that this guy might win that election. And if he won rather than Sirleaf, that would be a problem. They thought this guy is likely to play by the sort of the old rules and corruption will flourish. Sure enough, since he took office, replacing Sirleaf last year, there have been a whole spate of corruption scandals. One at the central bank, a couple relating to a bunch of fancy new homes and condos that he's built for apparently for sale and money making in the capital. And people are back out in the streets in Monrovia. It's now in a very delicate situation again because of frustration about corruption and economic mismanagement. A kind of tragic coda or epilogue to a sovereignty sharing initiative that during its term of existence was widely regarded as a success. And so you can see at the outset of this initiative, strong need for external leverage and domestic commitment. There's the possibility that you can have these significant performance payoffs, but the local consent didn't last long. They didn't want international advisors around for 30 years. And after those handoffs took place, you saw a settling back into some of the old patterns of behavior based on the continued existence of strong incentives not to abide by Weberian governance principles. And so today, if you drive through Monrovia, you'll still see a lot of signs like this one, saying, criticizing corruption as a scourge that's afflicting the country. A very different mechanism for dealing with corruption happened in Guatemala, and the CICIG, the Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, was created in 2006-07 to deal with this legacy, the legacy of the 36-year civil war, the overhang of that, because many of the paramilitary groups that were active during the civil war in Guatemala sort of morphed into criminal syndicates with continued links to the government in the period after the civil war ended in 1996. And so while this has gotten a lot of international attention, the wartime atrocities, there continued to be a very, very high murder rate. I think it was something like, the murder rate was something like 47 out of every 100,000 in the year 2006, one of the highest in the world. And people in Guatemala were understandably extremely exercised by that and pushed on the government to do something about it. International donors, including the United States, did as well. People like Leahy in the Senate conditioned some U.S. assistance to Guatemala taking more serious steps about criminal accountability. And in 2007, there was a kind of perfect storm in which a number of things happened. One was that there was a presidential election, and both candidates, the conservative Otto Perez Molina and the left-leaning Alvaro Colom, knew that the population wanted them to do something about the spate of killings in Guatemala. A second factor was that there had been a really salacious scandal surrounding the murder of 4 Central American parliamentarians, and then the subsequent butchery of the accused persons in a Guatemalan prison, which led everybody to believe that the state security forces had murdered the parliamentarians. That brought an international outcry. And combined with that, there were a few other well-timed or ill-timed, from the government's perspective, scandals that led to a crescendo of demands for a serious anti-impunity process. That led to the CICIG, which, unlike some of the others we're mentioning, was actually ratified as a treaty between the UN and Guatemala. And in 2007, this guy, Carlos Castrosana, became the first commissioner of CICIG. It was not easy going at the outset because there were a lot of people, as you would imagine, inside the Guatemalan government who were not enthusiastic about having an international unit of UN appointees nested within the Guatemalan judiciary. CICIG has the authority to engage in criminal investigations and also to serve as sort of accompany prosecutors and sort of stand beside and assist prosecutors in the Guatemalan justice sector. And so CICIG began and faced immediate headwinds, but it was able to earn public trust. And one of the fascinating cases where it earned public trust happened in 2009, where this guy, Rodrigo Rosenberg, made a video and then sent it around, and it went viral, saying, if you watch this video, it's because I've been murdered and it's at the hand of the President Alvaro Colom. And then 2 days later, he was found gunned down on the side of the road. This brought people, hundreds of thousands of people, into the streets in Guatemala, thinking Colom had ordered this guy's murder. After all, this guy had a video saying that that's what was going to happen to him. CICIG investigated it and using techniques of DNA and forensics and documentary analysis and other sophisticated investigatory techniques that were rare in Guatemala, was actually able to prove to an incredulous public that Rosenberg had orchestrated his own murder for the purpose of framing Colom. Not everybody agreed with that outcome, but everyone did agree, more or less everyone in the country agreed, that it had been a highly professional investigation and that there was compelling evidence brought to bear. That really woke up the population to Guatemala that this CICIG is fundamentally different. The level of detail put into this sensational investigation, because it was so sensational, everyone watched it on TV, like an O.J. Simpson trial moment, that type of thing, right? Everyone's watching. And they were able to see the CICIG perform well. And so it won a lot of popular trust. There were nevertheless continued domestic crosswinds. There was a sort of a wind blowing toward greater accountability and building on the CICIG's work. And there were also forces opposed to it, led by this guy, the ex-general Efrain Rios Montt, who was the head of a kind of a right-wing party in Guatemala that remained powerful. One of the things CICIG was able to do, although wartime atrocities were not part of its mandate, it was nevertheless there in part to build up the public ministry, the public prosecutor's office, and actually helped them develop the evidence that led to Rios Montt's conviction for genocide, a conviction then later overturned on procedural grounds by the Constitutional Court. As I said, there were two winds going. Rios Montt and others were opposing what the CICIG was doing, but there was more and more public and international support for its work, and particularly it took a step forward when it appointed Claudia Paz y Paz as the new public prosecutor. Very dynamic, energetic, courageous prosecutor, carried out a string of investigations in Guatemala, ranging from crimes involving the Zetas and the Sinaloa cartel to public health pension scandal to a case against an ex-president for corruption, a variety of very high-profile cases, not all of which CICIG won, but all of which the public saw and appreciated. And it was during this time with Paz y Paz that CICIG, originally created generally to deal with impunity and state-linked crime, shifted its focus increasingly toward corruption, under the argument that corruption is inextricable from these state-linked crimes. It came to a head in 2015 when sitting President Otto Perez Molina was himself accused for corruption in a scandal called La Linea, because there was a phone hotline that people were using where you could basically get lower import duties in exchange for an envelope. And Perez Molina and Baldetti, the vice president, and others were implicated in making millions of dollars by basically selling these credits for lower import taxes. Perez Molina clearly had a disincentive to allow CICIG to continue its work, but among other things, then Vice President Biden showed up and said, we very much encourage you to continue to let it run its course, and there might be implications if CICIG is not given a free hand to do its work. And so here again, we have the importance of international leverage in kind of keeping this delicate political equilibrium intact and the sovereignty sharing on the tracks. Ultimately, CICIG's case on the La Linea scandal brought down the Perez Molina government after masses of people crowded around the government buildings in Guatemala City. I'm not sure this has ever happened in another case in which an international vehicle like CICIG has brought down a sitting president on corruption grounds. And in 2017, it looked like there might be a deja vu incident when the then CICIG commissioner Ivan Velasquez and Thelma Aldana, the public prosecutor, brought similar kinds of corruption charges against President Jimmy Morales, who himself had campaigned on anti-corruption. Morales tried to throw them out. Remarkably, the Congress and the Constitutional Court said, no, CICIG has to stay. And so for a while, some of the institutions of government were protecting the commission. By that point, the CICIG was the only public institution in Guatemala with a higher approval rating than the Catholic Church. CICIG was up to about 70% approval rating. The Catholic Church was a little below that, and all of the public security and judicial institutions were in the 10s or 20s, maybe 30% approval rating. So this commission's performance had won it tremendous public legitimacy. But ultimately, it wasn't enough. Morales had the right as the sovereign every 2 years to review and choose to renew CICIG's presence in Guatemala or not. and just last month decided that there was going to be no renewal. The newly elected president, who's an ally politically of Morales, has also made clear he's not going to restart this process. And so CICIG had an astounding run, really, of challenging corruption at the highest levels, but was always subject to criticisms that this unelected commissioner was usurping too much authority in the system, and therefore always facing political headwinds by those who were keen to avoid CICIG's focus. And ultimately, although the commission was able to implement a lot of change, new laws, new procedures in the Guatemalan judiciary, there's a lot of concern, including among the CICIG's own members, that this won't last long at all now that CICIG's work is done. And so, again, you have this fragility of a winning supportive coalition. You can start the vicious circle by performing well and gaining public legitimacy, but there's still going to be ultimately vulnerability to this kind of elite blowback, and that's what's happened to CICIG. For advocates of the commission, it's a kind of sad conclusion to its work, and the prospects don't look very good for judicial independence and accountability right now in Guatemala. So just to wrap up, this is the last slide, is to say that there's a pretty unappetizing menu of options. That's the reason why we would consider shared sovereignty at all, because the other options aren't very appealing. It can provide a useful stopgap, but we don't see a lot of evidence so far of it contributing to sustained reforms. And the reason I think it's worth studying this is that we still have choices about whether it's worth it to engage on these costly and normatively contentious ventures as a stopgap measure. And we need to understand the political dynamics to be able to make sound choices. So that's all I had to say. I'm sorry I ran a little bit long, but I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thanks for listening to this episode. Be sure to check out all of our content online for free at tnsr.org.